excited to hear from John Mulcahy, John Wave, and Carter Ingram Carter, and John Radke. Right. They work respectively for Georgia Pacific, EY, and the Coca-Cola Company. And they're going to talk to us today about why ecosystem services is essential, how they work with partners to make positive changes in forests and water, and what you can do to engage them. So hi, everybody. I'm Judy Tackett, your host for today. And I'm a wildlife biologist and a senior advisor for ecosystem services and organizational development with Keeping Forests. Keeping Forests is a diverse coalition, 40 partners strong, and we work to protect and conserve the natural, economic, and cultural value of southern forests. We're working hard to conserve the 245 million acres of southern forests, because if we don't, by 2060, we'll lose about 23 million acres of southern woodlands, or about 19 Grand Canyons. The best way that we have found to maintain these forests is to work with families and other private landowners. These folks work with foresters and other experts to actively manage about 85% of the region's 245 million acres of timberlands. So our three-pronged strategy consists of promoting forest products, which includes construction technologies, as you see here, and building codes that are forest friendly. Generating critical mass by connecting the dots between responsible forest management and the vitality of southern forests, and creating emerging markets to build an investment model between responsible forest management, build an investment model that benefits private landowners, and as well as clean air and clean water that originates in their forests. So these ecosystem services are why we are here today. So we're going to go ahead and hear from you. You can scan this QR code on your phone, or you can go to slido.com. And we would love to hear from you. What does the term ecosystem services mean to you? You just put in that code 85441. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen and share this. And so you can see we're already starting to get some input from people. We have clean air, water, clean water, air, carbon, timber. If you'll just keep putting in, here we go, see it's populating. You all can see this, right, as it's populating? Great. So water's coming out pretty strongly. Strong economy. Whoa, sustainability just jumped up there. Habitat, these are great. So we'll just take a few more seconds, about 30 seconds. Non-market forest benefits, strong economy. These are all great. Habitat, sustainability. So you see the words that are really coming up. Habitat seems to be pretty strong. Biodiversity. This is great. You can put in as many words as you'd like. Great. Thank you so much for this. So John, while I flip back to the slide deck, just want to maybe get your reactions on this. Maybe you could also answer the question and just talk about what ecosystem services mean to you. And Carter and John, I'll also get your thoughts.
Yeah, I'd be glad to, Judy. And I do think that the breadth of responses that we have seen from the group is pretty indicative of the types of ecosystem services that are out there. And I really think about ecosystem services as benefits that derive from the natural environment that benefit our world. It's not necessarily just people, but the globe itself. I know when we've talked about ecosystem services and you look at the different categories of them, the ones that people think of most of the time are referred to as provisioning services. So that's the timber and the game and the fish and the water, that things that people use and consume that come out of that. But they have supporting services. They're critical for soil formation and flood control and things of that nature. There's regulating services that they provide, which is the carbon sequestration and the air filtration. But another one that maybe people don't think about initially, but makes a lot of sense when they hear about it, is the cultural services, and there's the spiritual and recreational activities that we get out of forests. So those, all of those comprise what I refer to as ecosystem services.
Great, thank you so much, John. Carter?
Yeah, well, thanks. And thanks everyone for being here today. When before I came to EY, where I work now, I led the ecosystem services program at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And, when I thought of ecosystem services, I was often focused on regulating services and cultural services, as John mentioned, but what I've experienced being in the corporate sector is that most people don't really use the phrase ecosystem services that often. I would say natural capital is much more common, and people tend to understand that a little bit more. And, as many of you know, that really refers to the stocks of natural resources that underpin the flows of ecosystem benefits from ecosystems, which we call ecosystem services. And just to, I share a lot of similarities with respect to perspective on this as to John. I would say most of the companies we work with are focused on natural capital, and the ecosystem services, even if they aren't calling them that exactly, that they're most focused on, at least from what I've seen, are really climate regulation in the form of carbon storage or carbon sequestration from forest. And so I think there's a lot probably of opportunity to explore some of the regulating services and to really help organizations understand the trade-offs between synergies between different ecosystem services, which I don't think is as elaborated and commonly discussed within the corporate sector, at least the communities that I operate in. But I'll talk about that a little bit later as well.
Great, that's a great perspective. Thank you so much, Carter. John? Nope, John, you're muted.
Thanks. You would think I would know that by now. This is my 12,000th Zoom meeting. Anyway, first of all, thanks a lot for having me and being willing to hear my point of view on this subject. It's kind of hard to add on to what John and Carter have already said about ecosystem services. It is kind of one of those catchphrases that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people and a lot of companies. And, I think in my mind, there a lot of it does revolve around, carbon sequestration, things like that. But also I would take it even further and say it's a big player in just climate resilience in general. Whether it's adding storage to water or filtration of water, reduce flooding, so many things that the ecosystem provides us that we don't even necessarily think about. We just take it for granted. From a company perspective, we think of it probably a little more narrowly. Our business relies on water, clean water, and so that's a big focus for us in this space. Also packaging, providing cardboard for certain types of packaging that we do, but also we try to extend it out to the communities where we operate. We really rely on healthy communities to buy our products. And that's where our customers are, consumers, even our employees for that matter. And so it's important to have healthy ecosystems to have healthy, viable communities. And that's just a big part of our business. So anyway, in addition to everything else that John and Carter mentioned.
Well, John, you did have quite a bit to add. Thank you for that. So John, Carter, and John, this is the question that we kind of posed to you, is if you could share some examples of how each one of your institutions is working on ecosystem services. And then I'm sure that we would love to hear from you kind of at the tail end, one suggestion on how the audience can engage corporations, just from your perspective and lessons learned. So John, I'm going to toss it over to you.
All right, thank you, Judy, and hello again, everybody. Judy mentioned that I work for Georgia Pacific at GP, which is where I've worked for 33 years now. I am responsible for the company's sustainability program. GP is a forest products company. We're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have 3 primary businesses. There's a building products business where we manufacture products like lumber and plywood. We've got a consumer products business that makes paper towels, toilet paper, paper plates and cups. And we have a packaging and cellulose business, which makes corrugated containers and cellulose pulp. GP operates 180 manufacturing facilities across the United States, most of which are located in the Southeast, so in these forests that we're talking about today. One of the things that we believe is that our products help to improve people's lives. If our products are used to provide shelter, they're used to improve hygiene. They help protect products when they're in transit, and they provide the convenience. So when you grab your Coca-Cola at the fountain, you can take it with you and not have to worry about returning that cup. So there's a lot of benefits that they provide, but they're products that are manufactured out of wood, which comes to the forest. And if you think about the manufacture of at least the pulp and paper side of our product line, you need a lot of wood, you need a lot of water, and you need a lot of energy to manufacture those products. And in our operations, all of those, the wood, the water, and the energy, are ecosystem services. The wood, of course, comes from thinnings through managing a forest, and from residual chips that come from a sawmill. Water, most of the water in the United States originates in forests, and it plays an important role in our planet's water cycle, collecting and filtering that water and returning it back to the ecosystem. But what may not be as much known about, at least our industry, is the importance for an energy standpoint. So we use the bark that's removed from the logs prior to processing, and the lignin, which is separated from the cellulose during the pulping process, to create a biomass energy, which generates the steam and electricity to run our mills. And so, as a company, just over half of all of the energy needs that we need to run our operations come from wood residuals. So it's not yet. If you can just go back a slide, Judy, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so it's no surprise that stewardship is one of our guiding principles. First of all, and obviously, we need to ensure that the supply of wood is maintained for the future, and employ good forestry practices and strong markets to help the landowners take care of their property, invest in the future. But we also realize that these resources should go to their highest and best use. And the highest and best use isn't necessarily always a 2x4 or a roll of brawny towels. When we talked about the different ecosystem services, you think about soil formation and pollination and carbon sequestration, flood control, beauty, all of those are benefits that come out of that forest as well. And so as forests provide all of these, we're committed to providing our products while using fewer resources and leaving more available to satisfy other needs in society in the future. And because our business requires the use of ecosystem services, we really want to focus on a couple of things: sourcing responsibly to minimize our impact, and investing in improving the ecosystem through engagement with other partners. I don't know if you can move to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how we want to advance ecosystem services at GP. First, through our practices of sourcing wood in our facilities, and then second, by our engagement in conservation activities. Most of or all of the wood that we get originates in the United States, which we believe to be the most sustainable wood baskets in the world. And it's important that we employ best management practices in the lands that we rely upon. We no longer own timberland. Back in the late 90s, GP owned about 6 million acres of timberland. Right now, we don't own any working forest, but we do have over 100 foresters and wood buyers who live in these communities. They know the landowners, they know the logging companies, they know the landscape, and that's important to have those relationships so that you understand the impact that takes place. We also rely upon third-party sustainable forestry certification, which helps to ensure that the best management practices are being employed by the loggers, that the land is returned, and those types of things as well. And when it's valuable, we can provide that chain of custody certification to our customers through either FSC or SFI, which are well-known and well-regarded certification bodies. We work to map endangered forests. We engaged in a project that probably started, I think, around 2008, working with 3 environmental organizations, NRDC, the Dogwood Alliance, and the Rainforest Action Network, and agreed upon a methodology to identify endangered forests, and which included a scoring mechanism. We then engaged with the forestry department at the University of Georgia and their GIS group and mapped all of the land that was in that basin and identified what is now 6.5 million acres of land that met that qualification of endangered forest. And so we have made a commitment not to source wood into our mills from those areas. Additionally, we focus on making sure there's the right balance of biodiversity, not only the wildlife that exists in the forest, but looking at the balance between hardwoods and softwoods. A lot of times through harvesting activities, it's the hardwoods will not replenish as quickly as a softwood, so you want to make sure that in certain areas that the hardwood stands are being maintained. All right, we can move to the next slide. But we think broader than just employing best management practices and employing or in supporting ecosystem services. We want to have a positive impact. You know, our commitment to stewardship really extends making sure that there's toilet paper on the shelf during the pandemic. And what we believe is that we want to be a preferred partner, and by doing that, drive sustainable outcomes that benefit the company and society. And so in order to get that done, we want to understand who our stakeholders are and what they care about, and then how can we behave in a way so that they choose to be associated with you. And as we thought about like who our stakeholders are, we had a pretty broad view of that. So it's the consumers that buy our products, it's our current employees, it's prospective employees, it's environmental organizations, it's lawmakers, it's the communities where we have operations. All of those want Georgia-Pacific to behave in a certain way. And then if you think about, well, what is it that they care about? We kind of identified 5 major themes. And the first, which is the subject of the discussion today, is conservation. But it also includes our use of non-renewable resources, our emissions, the sustainability of our products, and our social responsibility and our engagement with the community. You know, we want our consumers to have an affinity for our brands. We want our customers to believe that we're an ethical and responsible company. We want our communities to be glad that we're here, and we want to do that by creating projects and acting in a way that benefits them. Recently, our Quilted Northern brand relaunched their Ultra Soft and Strong line with an environmental theme, as our consumers told us is that this was important to them. Our new product rollout not only touts the energy and the water efficiency of the manufacturing process, but also establishes a relationship with the Arbor Day Foundation. By the end of this year, the Arbor Day Foundation expects to plant more than 2 million trees as a part of that program. These trees are not being planted in basins that will eventually provide timber for our operations. They're selected based on ecological needs, such as the wildfire restoration out in the West Coast, reforesting land that was destroyed by Hurricane Michael in the Southeast, and reforesting land or improving land that has been degraded or impacted by land use change, pests, and disease. We've identified 10 sites across 9 states and are working with the Arbor Day Foundation to identify more as this relationship is expected to continue in the future. But the Quilted Northern example is just one of many partnerships that we've developed to drive conservation. We have projects with groups like the Nature Conservancy and the Longleaf Alliance, amongst others. You know, within TNC, we're in the middle of a 3-year project to restore longleaf pine habitat adjacent to Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia. So, you know, our business would not exist without forests. We're focused on conserving forests, not only because we want to ensure a long-term supply of raw materials, and not only because our consumers, employees, communities expect us to. We're focused on conserving forests because of all of the benefits that they provide, and being able to connect these projects like the Quilted Northern, I think, is a great way that companies can engage those different ecosystems and have an improvement that benefits all of society. And as you think about, you know, the one suggestion that Judy asked each of us to talk about is to think about who your stakeholders are and what they care about. And so as we did that, as I mentioned, we hit consumers and employees and communities, and conservation was at the top of the list, and that really kind of provided the organizational focus for us to go out and make an investment like we have in these individual projects. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. I mean, I learned quite a bit about GP in such a short period of time. Thank you. Carter, we're gonna go to you if you don't mind.
Great, thank you. Great, so I'm going to talk about some of our efforts at Ernst & Young, where I work. I work in our sustainability team, and I work on trying to integrate sustainability into business strategy and business decisions. And I'm going to start with this photo, which is actually a picture of a place I worked before I came to EY, when I was at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And this is in Rwanda, where there's a big national forest area called Nyungwe National Park, and really important area. And anecdotally, it was believed to be a really important source of water for the country. But it wasn't known exactly how forests were regulating water quantity or water quality. And we did a series of analyses to try to understand those relationships. And it was really enlightening for informing management and conservation throughout the country. And I want to start with that because I think understanding those relationships between forest and water is really important for understanding how we can best manage some of the ecosystem services that come from forest, and to try to navigate some of the trade-offs that might happen as a result of different management activities. So we can go to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about today are a few ways in which we work with companies and other organizations to integrate sustainability related to forest and water into decision making. And that is through strategy and goal setting, through understanding how to manage risks related to natural capital, including forest and water, synthesizing data and information that doesn't exist to inform decision making, especially around natural capital, and how to measure and value your impacts, companies' impacts and dependencies on nature. And then, you know, some metrics that have been developed recently to support reporting in these areas. And so I'll just start by sharing some of the work that we do around helping companies set their sustainability goals that directly influence their business operations, decisions, and investments related to natural capital. And what we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years, and I'd love to hear from my colleagues about this, is that increasingly, as sustainability has evolved, it's moved, away from sort of corporate social responsibility to become much more scientifically rigorous and robust and integrated into core business decisions. We've seen that the goals that companies set are also becoming much more rigorous, especially around natural capital. And we know that, setting public-facing goals is really important for creating customer trust and loyalty. And in fact, we've run some consumer index surveys that have shown that most respondents are more likely to buy from companies who are transparent in their practices, their commitments, and their performance towards achieving those commitments. And having sustainability goals and relevant supporting metrics is a really important way to demonstrate, one, your commitment to sustainability around land, water, and forests, and to help you communicate your performance. And so we've worked with a range of companies across different sectors. I focus a lot on the food and agribusiness sector to set goals around land use and forest. One of the areas where we focused a lot is on helping companies think about setting eliminating deforestation from their supply chains and really exploring how that can be achieved. But also around water and what that actually means. We've looked at we've helped companies set their goals around both water quantity and water quality goals. And the water quality goals can be actually quite tricky, especially how you measure that in different parts of the country or the world, especially if you're a global company. And I'd love to hear John Radkick's from Coca-Cola's thoughts on that. We can go to the next slide. And as we think about opportunities to engage, this is a new initiative that EY is a part of, along with a lot of other organizations. And this is an initiative that is helping companies figure out how they can measure and report on their risks, their financial risks related to natural capital or nature, including forest and water. This is called the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. It's an initial working group that's being pulled together to scope out what this task force would look like. And it is meant to emulate the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has gotten a decent amount of traction over the last few years and was spearheaded by Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney. And really, I think this is important because it's helping companies really think that the goal is to help companies think about what the financial risks are of negatively impacting forest and water that your company depends on, as well as other ecosystem services and biodiversity. And this is, again, early days and something to watch and be aware of, especially as it grows. And I imagine there will be opportunities for people and organizations to engage. And go to the next slide. And so, you set goals and strategy, and you need to measure your risks associated with natural capital, including forest and water. But one of the things we've heard from a lot of our clients, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, is that a lot of times the data that we need around forest, water, and biodiversity, and a lot of other aspects of ecosystems is not always available, especially in a format that is consistently collected over time and at consistent spatial scales. And so we've been working with the USGS, the Powell Center, and SYSYNC to pilot natural capital accounts for the US, to develop pilot natural capital accounts for the US. And they're focused on land and water, and land includes forests, as well as ecosystem accounts. And one of the things we are exploring is, one, how can this data be compiled over time? And we're developing it in alignment with the UN SIA standards for natural capital accounting and ecosystem accounting. And we're exploring how can the private sector, how can businesses benefit from this information, and how can they be supporters of these accounts moving forward. But the idea is that a lot of companies are not tracking a lot of the data around biodiversity and ecosystem services that they might need to measure risks and dependencies that are important for their businesses. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And another initiative that many of you may have heard of, and this is a big organization, the Natural Capital Coalition is an organization that many of your organizations may already be a part of. EY was a part of this early on. And this was an important initiative that was led by the Natural Capital Coalition to develop the Natural Capital Protocol. And I show this because, you know, once you have the data, you need to understand how to measure and value your natural capital impacts and dependencies as a business. And the protocol helps organizations go through that process. And this was a big initiative to develop this protocol. It was a collaboration of companies, of NGOs, academics, and they continue to do work to explore how to integrate the capitals, natural capital and social capital, into business decision making. And the protocol is a really important framework for helping companies measure those impacts and dependencies related to forest and water, but also other ecosystem services. We can go to the next slide. And then finally, reporting. A lot of companies, you know, most companies are reporting on their performance related to sustainability. As I mentioned, when they set goals around land, water, forest, other aspects of sustainability, one of the most important things is reporting in a consistent way on how you're making progress in those areas. And I wanted to share this because this is an initiative. There's an initiative that was a collaboration of the other big accounting firms, EY, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, and was led by the World Economic Forum's International Business Council, which is chaired by the CEO of Bank of America. And the charge was to develop a set of universal metrics or disclosures that all businesses, regardless of their sector, could use to measure and communicate their contributions to sustainable development and long-term value creation. And the impetus behind this was that there's really just a huge confusing landscape of different metrics and reporting frameworks that companies use to tell their sustainability story and their performance over time. This helps simplify that landscape. And I bring it up today because we spent a lot of time on the land use and the water metrics in particular, and those were tricky ones to get at, but they address some of the issues we're talking about here today. And we believe this is important because the ultimate expectation is that all companies would report on this, so we could understand and be able to compare across sectors, across companies, what their impacts are in these different areas aligned to the Sustainable Development Agenda. And as it pertains to our conversation today, how companies are impacting land use and water and greenhouse gas emissions. So I will stop there. And I should just say, I want to add one thing as we talk about suggestions and opportunities for people to get involved. I should have mentioned this. The Natural Capital Accounting Initiative I mentioned is, you know, an ongoing initiative, and please reach out to me if you have any interest in getting involved in that. That's certainly a collaboration, and we invite people to engage and explore how they might be able to contribute. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carter. That's a great suggestion, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of interest in that. And I'm looking forward to seeing the Q&A that comes and questions for you. I think you covered a really great broad spectrum of topics, and your kind of your how you're plugged into different companies is a great perspective. So thank you. John, we're going to turn it to you now in Coca-Cola.
All right. So if you take a step back and look at a company like Coca-Cola, you know, we have so many sustainability initiatives. You know, kind of what John was alluding to. When you look in the environmental space, you know, we have a lot of goals, targets, initiatives around packaging. We call it World Without Waste. So reducing our packaging, but also collecting those packages back so we can recycle them. We have, you know, like everybody else, lots of climate goals, targets. We just announced our science-based target for carbon. We have sustainable ingredient sourcing goals, working with our agricultural supply chain. And then we have our water sustainability goals. I personally lead our water sustainability program for North America. So today, when we're talking about natural capital and forest and everything, I am going to kind of look, specifically at the water aspect, because that's what I do and what I can bring my expertise to. So that's going to be our focus. Now, Coca-Cola has a whole, I could go in so many different directions too, just on our water goals, whether it's, efficiency in our operations and all of our risk assessments, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to focus specifically on a goal that we initially set way back in 2008. We call it our water replenish goal. And that goal is to return to nature and communities the same amount of water that we use in our beverages. As you can imagine, we depend on water, for everything, but, the biggest part is it's the main ingredient in everything that we make. So, a Coca-Cola tastes good, it's fizzy and all that, but, it's over 95% water. So water is really important to us. So we set this goal for several reasons. One is to reduce risk to our operations. Another one is to have a positive impact on the communities where we operate. Another one is, it's actually for reputation and building up our brand's reputation and brand love. We did a lot of marketing research, and it turns out that consumers and people are very interested and concerned about water resources. And it's interesting. It seems like it always comes up to the top of, what consumers' concerns are in their willingness to purchase a product, based on that company's, track record in restoring watersheds and things like that. So for several reasons, it's really important for our company. Now, what I wanted to do was just give some examples of what this water replenish program looks like. In general, what we do is look for projects to do in watersheds that we can calculate and translate that into water replenish volumes. And usually what it is restoring the watersheds back to its natural condition. And we initially developed, the methodology to calculate that. Since then, several other companies have joined this water replenish type of goal, and we've standardized the accounting methodology for this. And now there's a bunch of companies who are driving for this same goal. I was going to give you some examples of what these look like, and I'll just run through a couple of them. Down in Florida, we work with both the U.S. Forest Service and American forests to do restoration of longleaf pine forests. And so it's basically replanting, reforestation. We have projects in Lower St. John's Basin, also the Apalachicola, and we've restored, the last numbers I've seen are on the order of nearly 1,000 acres down in that particular project. We're able to translate that into water replenished volumes by reduced runoff, increased infiltration, things like that. Go ahead to the next one, thank you. Another example this is in Georgia. We worked with Alabama Georgia Trust, and it's conserving land. Just putting a conservation easement on literally thousands of acres of forested land that we kind of selected along with the trust that is adjacent to areas that are developing or are being clear cutted. And so if you can put that in trust, then we're able to, maintain that natural condition. And what we do is we calculate a water volume from that compared to what the future state might be. And if it is developed or clear cut or whatever, and then if we can keep it in its natural state, then we can take replenish credits for that. Go to the next one. Down in Louisiana, we're working on a big project to restore cypress swamps, and the overall project is restoring, thousands of acres of forest, and a lot of it is cypress. We're also working on the wetland component, even to the point where we bought giant pumps to pump water over to these new swamps and wetlands that they're developing so that it can, regenerate itself. Go to the next one. Texas thorn scrub, right down, around the Rio Grande. It's a really valuable ecosystem, that there's so much biodiversity down there. There's supposed to be, with ocelots and all sorts of critters that are endangered because, the land use is taking away the natural habitat. So we've worked with American Forest there to do Texas thorn scrub reforestation, I guess you could call it, but it's more like bushes and whatnot. So anyway, that also helps protect, in fact, all of these help protect our water supplies, and we can calculate that into replenished volumes too. So go to the next one. This is up in the Sierra Nevada. It's not just the forests and the trees themselves. A lot of times it's the meadows that occur within these forests, and that's where a lot of the water is stored naturally. You think of green infrastructure, these high mountain meadows are just, big reservoirs of water that store water naturally, and then it'll feed it out during the dry periods, nice, cool, clean water. So we did projects in these degraded streams and degraded meadows to restore it. It's called plug and pond method, where you put big plugs in and it backs up the water, and then it gradually raises the water table and restores the natural hydrology. So you can go to the next one. Forest fires. There's right now, that's the world we live in, is just catastrophic forest fires happening one after another. So we work with partners to just do the reforestation in the aftermath of these fires. I think everybody knows the effect that has on watersheds. So go to the next one. And this is in Hawaii. Invasive species are a big issue down there. They're trying to maintain their forests, which in Hawaii, the forests are so important because they get 400 inches of rainfall. This is on Oahu. And that feeds the aquifer underneath, which is surrounded by salt water, and they're continually sucking water out of there. And so you have to continue that infiltration into that aquifer. And what's happening is there's wild boars, hogs, that are destroying the natural vegetation. It's creating erosion problems. There's tons of runoff that's occurring, and the water's not soaking in the ground. So we're doing a huge project to put up, I think it's something like 5,000 feet of fence, maybe more than that, to isolate areas and then get the wild pigs out of there. And then that is actually a restoration program. Next. And this is another meadow restoration we're doing in New Mexico. There's degraded, meadows and incised streams. And once again, just like in that other example I showed up in the Sierra Nevada, when you restore that, it restores the natural hydrology and storage. And then if you go to the next slide, which is a specific example from the one I just showed, at some of the scale that we can do this on. So we work with partners. When we first started this Replenish program out, we worked with World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy to kind of figure out how it works. And then they came to us with some projects that we could try. And gradually what we turned that into, instead of just having the stakeholders give us projects and us fund them, we were looking at our water risk and our operations and started targeting, okay, we really need to do stuff here and there. And then we would reach out to any number of stakeholders and whatever the local stakeholders were that had an interest in that particular watershed. And then they would have their own objectives, and we'd have our objectives around water. And then we'd kind of see what projects we could both do together where there's that overlap, where we're meeting our targets and objectives and they're meeting theirs. And then, we can kind of get together on implementing these. This particular project is in the Comanche Creek watershed. It's a tributary of the Rio Grande in the Carson National Forest. There's a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and Trout Unlimited. And this sub-watershed was really degrading. Inside streams, there's a native cutthroat trout, Rio Grande cutthroat trout breeding ground here, or spawning ground. that was, really threatened. And so we worked with them for over a period of, I think it's been going on 4 years now, to invest each year to do these restoration initiatives to restore these natural meadows. Then what we did was we held a couple meetings out there and invited other companies, Facebook, Intel, some other beverage companies, and other government entities too. And we invited them out there and said, look at what the issue is here, the problem, and here's some of the fixes. And if we can get together, we could really start to scale this up. What happened was we had several companies buy on. They said, yeah, we'll invest in this. And then we even had another branch of the New Mexico state government, the Fish and Wildlife. They had a fund where they get funds from sales of ammunition, and then they allocate that for environmental projects. And they said they would match any corporate funding 3-to-1. And so what ended up happening, we got all this funding set up, and we're doing these projects. And then all of a sudden, the Forest Service said, hey, you know what? We have enough funding to finish the restoration on this whole watershed. Let's turn our attention now to another watershed. And meanwhile, this one is going to continue to be restored. So it was actually a really good story and example of how, you can really start to make a difference at scale if you get enough stakeholders together. I'm going to leave it at that and save some time for Q&A.
Well, John, thank you for that. And it really struck me, like the scale at which Coca-Cola works at, a global company, and you have very local projects. Just one quick question for you is a suggestion on how folks can engage with you or with Coke or with corporations, just really quickly before we jump to the Q&A.
Okay, so how they could engage with Coke, I would say, first of all, figure out, try to get as many stakeholders as you can if there's a problem in your watersheds, and especially if it's watersheds where Coke operates, which is in most watersheds actually, and just try to identify what the issues are. And I'm trying to think of how you could bring them to us. Usually do it through NGO stakeholders who we engage with, and then they will bring it to our attention, that, hey, here's a forest that has a problem, or a natural habitat that has an issue, and are you interested in working in this area? And I guess how they engage with us that's just one tiny bit of it. But I would say engage with somebody. Don't just work in your own little silo. Get out there and try to find others who have the same interests. And the more stakeholders you can bring to the table, the more you can accomplish.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to the way I would answer that question, Judy. I think what you saw with the examples that John gave, and earlier with some examples that I gave, was that you could see a tie between the overall business viability, the business objectives, and the investment in the ecosystems in that area. And so if you are in a watershed and you see a need for a project, I think it would be interesting to look at who are the entities that rely upon that ecosystem for their long-term viability. That's why we looked at the importance of water, the importance of timber. And so what we're hoping to get out of some of these examples is to say that you can engage the local companies. It could be a beverage company, it could be a brewery, it could be a paper mill. There's lots of large users of water other than the municipalities, and kind of understanding who they are, and then having conversations with them about what's important to their stakeholders is important. And kind of what helped us to get there was thinking about who our stakeholders are and what they care about. And as we went through that process, we realized that the communities in which we operate were important. We wanted them to be glad that Georgia Pacific was a part of that community, and employees was important. We wanted them to be proud that they were working for Georgia Pacific because they share their values. And so finding that way to make a connection with those big entities that are in your watershed and talking about things that matter to them, I think it helps to make those connections.
Great. Thank you so much for that, John. I really appreciate it. Well, we have a lot of time for Q&A. Rick, you want to turn on your video for us? And I'm sure that you've gotten quite a few questions. So do you want to start with the first one?
Sure, and they have been coming in fast and furious. I'll try to keep up with them.
Thanks, Rick.
There's a couple that are kind of housekeeping questions that I'd like to start with, Judy, and maybe they're directed more at you. Folks are asking if contact information for the panelists can be shared.
Sure.
The other one
I'm just going to go ahead and speak for John and Carter. John.
No, that's great.
Yes, we will do
the
that.
other kind of housekeeping question was, would there be any handouts available, or would the presentations be made available? I noted in an answer I provided that the link to this webinar will be shared. And we do have some handouts on keeping forests on our website. But
And yeah, and the recording from this webinar will be made available. You can use the same link. So if you want to get back to it, listen, just re-listen to anything again. And folks have, I think my email is a contact point, so you can always email me as well if you're kind of not finding what you need.
Okay. One of the questions that was asked has been answered, so I won't repeat it. It basically was, how do you approach the companies to be able to work with them? How do you find out who within the company you need to contact? And I think John and John just talked about that.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that, Rick, too. I know all of our operations, and I imagine that the same is for Coca-Cola, has a kind of a community engagement lead, and so it's probably pretty easy to find out who that is for the facility that's in your watershed.
Okay. This is a question for the panelists. It wasn't directed at a specific one. So the question is, do any of you ever work with private foundations underwriting national ecosystems education initiatives?
Carter, you want to take that first?
Carter's shaking.
No, I haven't worked with private foundations on that topic. I've worked with private foundations in the past, but not on that. So I'll pass it to my other panelists.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I work with foundations either.
John, Coca-Cola does have a foundation.
Well, we have our own foundation, and we do, provide some funding for education programs in this space. But I got to tell you, it's once our companies set specific targets and metrics around, water and whatever, most of the funding that we get has to go towards those, and education isn't necessarily a metric, even though we understand it's really important. It's more of an enabling thing.
Okay.
Now we do support organizations that are focused on education. So for example, we have the Georgia Forestry Foundation here in the state of Georgia. Kind of that's the educational arm of the Georgia Forestry Association. So kind of educating folks around the value of forestry is important. We also support here locally the Chattahoochee Nature Center, which is their goal is connecting people with nature, and so GP supports through our foundation a number of those organizations.
Okay. Would like to share a comment that someone posted, that state fish and wildlife agencies can match donations with a 3-to-1 match on eligible projects related to fish and wildlife. It's a great opportunity for building public-private partnerships. Thank you for that comment and letting folks know about that. Recognizing, this is for all the presenters, recognizing that some of the presenters are companies that also operate in Canada, can any of them comment on initiatives in Canada?
The projects that I shared from the US, we also have the same goals, for all of our business units, Canada being one. they also are, I didn't even mention that we reached our goal of being 100% replenished 5 years early in 2015, and we're still maintaining that and growing it. In Canada, we have also reached that goal, and we have several active projects going on. They're very similar to the ones I just mentioned. And a couple of those are forest related projects too.
And I would say we approach the conservation opportunities in Canada similarly to how we do it in the United States, which is trying to understand where the largest needs are and where the largest risks are. And so two projects that come to mind right now that we supported recently in that area were related to the decline of woodland caribou in the Boreal. And so we've got a project underway understanding nutrition impacts heading into the winter and what that does to the viability of the herd. And so, the point being that you'll pick a project that is, kind of important for that particular ecosystem versus picking another one in the Southeast, for example.
Okay. I think this one also has a potential to be addressed by several of the panel members. Thinking on a landscape level, what barriers do you see to better recognition of and appreciation of ecosystem services values, and how does a collaboration such as keeping forests address those barriers? Who wants to take a shot?
I'm happy to start. If I understood the question correctly, I mean, I think a landscape scale approach is really helpful for understanding how ecosystem services are generated in a specific area. So especially when we start thinking about regulating services, for example, the regulation of water quality and quantity, soil stabilization, for example, which forest can help, provide an important role in doing. You really need to take a landscape scale to really understand the degree to which those services are being generated at scale. And so I think a landscape scale perspective is really helpful. I think the challenge is then relating that scale to individual actors in the landscape. And as someone who was a scientist before I came to the corporate sector, I think a lot of scientific studies are done at the landscape scale. But in some cases, if that scale is much bigger than the scale at which a company, for example, is working or making decisions, it can be difficult for them to figure out how to use that information about ecosystem services. So I do think, one, the scale is really important for understanding the dynamics of ecosystem services across a relevant area, whether it be a watershed or coastal area, for example, or a wetland. And then I think the next step is trying to relate that to the scale at which decisions are made by individuals.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Carter. And that's what I was going to say. So landscape scale is a great way to approach it, or a lot of times I think from a watershed scale. But it's so large that it's, first of all, it's hard to envision that, okay, what's it going to take to make a difference on the landscape scale? We do projects, I probably have, I think like 80 active projects just in the US that I shared a few of them. But when you look at the landscape scale, is it really making a difference? Is it moving the needle? What's it take to move that needle? And it's almost seems too daunting to tackle. And then, so a lot of things I think just get stopped even before they get started because, oh, that problem is too big to solve. The second thing is you have such diversity of stakeholders typically that have their own interests. And a lot of times it's hard to even get the conversation going. I think about, that project I mentioned in New Mexico, there are cattle ranchers there and they have leases and they, graze their cattle on Forest Service land, and they were tearing up these streams. That was a big part of the problem. It was hard to get them to the table. They did come to the table. And then all of a sudden they hired extra cowboys to keep the cows out of the streams. And they made that agreement, that commitment. And then while we did the other restoration, it's an example of how it takes a lot of effort and work, but you can get these diverse stakeholders together sometimes. But that's a big challenge, I think, anywhere you look on that broad scale.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to that is, from a corporate standpoint, particularly with national brands, it can first appear hard to connect a local project to a national brand. And I think and John talked about it a little bit with all the different projects he's got going on. If you can weave together all of those projects into, kind of a better story than a wildfire reclamation project in the Tahoe National Forest and a longleaf pine project in Florida and a hurricane restoration in Georgia, even though they're three different things, can all be kind of tied together into an overall commitment to stewardship. And then that makes it more interesting to the people that manage our brands to support.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So we're still getting lots and lots of questions. Hopefully we'll be able to get the most of them, and I can keep them organized. Going back to a question you've already addressed, but it's just popping up a lot. There's folks are asking what are the best ways to get in touch with corporations like with GP and Coca-Cola and EY? How do we get in touch with those folks? How do we get on their radar? How are we able to initiate projects locally? Is there any other advice that you can provide folks along those lines?
So I have a question about when they say we, what is we? Is it an individual? Is it a
utility?
The questions I'm seeing lead me to believe it's organizations, smaller nonprofits, organizations like that, NGOs and environmental groups.
So I can answer for Coca-Cola, and the answer is not sending John an email, because it'll get buried and probably won't recognize it. But as I mentioned, we do have a foundation, and if there's specific projects do you think that fit our goals and metrics and everything, anybody is free to get on and try to do a proposal for a grant. But beyond that, John mentioned it before, we have regional, what we call public affairs communication directors associated with the company. And I'm sure if you get online, you can find your way to one of those people. What happens a lot, because I can't keep my eyes on everything, the whole globe especially, but if they bring things that they think look good to me, then it'll start getting attention. And the last thing I'll say is I'm an avid fly fisherman. I didn't even add that to my reasons for why ecosystem services are so important. For some reason, whenever I get a project that says we want to restore trout streams, then I do give it attention.
I might just add to that, maybe very generally, I would say, and again, coming from the NGO world now to the corporate world, and kind of understanding the difference in those worlds, I'll say, I think they don't come together very often. And so one of the things I would suggest at a general level is, if this is something you're interested in, there are a lot of conferences. Green Biz is one. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has an annual sustainability conference that a lot of chief sustainability officers go to. And there's not a lot of cross-pollination between the NGO world and some of those conferences. So I would say, if that's of interest to you, that's one possibility. And I would say, a lot of the conferences I go to, like the ACES conference, for example, there really are not many representatives from the private sector at that conference. So I do think, trying to cross-pollinate and engage more with some of these organizations in settings like that can be useful. There's also, organizations like the Natural Capital Coalition that bring together the private sector and NGO worlds. And so being a part of a coalition like that can be helpful for engaging with a wider range of companies with whom you might have shared interests. And then the final point I'll make that I think is really important is we use very different language in the NGO world and the science world versus the corporate world around some of these things, and trying to really find common ground with respect to the way in which you communicate some of these issues, thinking about shared incentives, shared objectives. If you can kind of start with that, it can really help facilitate dialogue.
I have one other thought that while you're speaking, I just thought of a way that an organization can get on the radar. So most companies, have several NGOs that they work with, or partners, stakeholders. WWF, the Nature Conservancy, for us, BEF is a big one. The National Forest Foundation. And if you can find out who those are, try to align with them, then all of a sudden you're almost automatically on our radar.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, with the upcoming change in administration, what opportunities are these companies seeing to invest in natural capital solutions? Are there any priorities they individually have?
I'm happy to start with that. I mean, I think one thing we've seen even before the change in administration is that 2020 was the year of big, ambitious commitments around climate change and natural solutions. For example, a few weeks ago, Nestle made a commitment to have half their emissions by 2030. And one way in which they're planning to do that is to plant, I believe it's 20 million trees per year over the next 10 years. And similarly, General Mills has made big commitments around regenerative agriculture, large area of regenerative agriculture. Walmart has made similar commitments to becoming a regenerative company, and reforestation is a key part of that. So I think, even before the change in administration, we saw a lot of momentum around companies making these big, bold commitments. Microsoft, for example, has made a commitment to become carbon negative. So I think the change in administration and the focus on climate change in particular is only going to increase the momentum and the energy we've seen around this in the past year, but really the past few years.
Yeah, and same thing with Coca-Cola. I mean, we had our 2020 goals, and now we established are establishing our 2030 goals, and they were happening already. I think what the change in administration might do, I hope it does, is will allow these projects to scale up, and the impact to scale up even more. Because now I have a feeling we'll start getting more federal funding for some of this stuff. Previously, that seemed like, almost from a corporate perspective, it's like, oh, well, I guess it's up to us to do it because no one else is going to do it. Now maybe that's going to change a bit.
Okay, next question. Can you provide some thoughts on projects that have had a positive impact on your bottom line results, as well as improving the environmental sustainability of the ecosystem in a particular region?
I can. I don't know if you guys, it's way on the other end of the continent, but California, remember the big drought that they had from like 2001 to 2011 or something, or beyond that, 2014, I think it was at its height. We started our replenish program and actually became what we consider water neutral in California. At that point, there was so many activists who were coming down on, for instance, bottled water. And they started attacking, I'm not going to name, the other companies that are in this that are competitors, and were boycotting their plants and caused a few of them to shut down. But we managed to stay out of that fray and out of those sites, because we could hold up this story about how we are replenishing over 100% of the water we use. For every drop we use, we give one back in California. And so I think, and I always argue, that work, we did it proactively, really kept us out of trouble and helped our business a lot. And every one of those projects was, like restoring these meadows and forests and all that kind of stuff. So they were ecosystem type projects. So just as an example of how I think it directly helped our company's bottom line.
Yeah, and I'd say a couple of examples I was thinking about with Georgia Pacific are, I guess the ones that come to mind first are the ones that are focused on increasing the efficiency of our use of water. So a paper mill both withdraws and discharges a significant amount of water on a daily basis. And we have mills who are in locations where water is relatively abundant, and we have mills in locations where it is not abundant, and particularly in certain seasons. And you get to levels where your ability to continue operating is at risk. And so in a couple of instances, we looked at what are some large, or what are some capital projects that we can do that will allow us to significantly decrease the amount of water we need to withdraw so that we can reutilize it or not need as much to drive forward. And so there was not only the cost that was associated with pumping, heating, cleaning, treating, and discharging in it as well, but that there was the impact on the environment that kept the water levels up that allowed us to continue to operate.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Hey, Rick, do you mind if I just jump in? John, some folks are asking for links, maybe to the Coke website where you list all the projects. So if you want to type in to the chat window, for everybody, a URL, you don't have to answer that now, but a URL that folks can go to, and they also want to see the map that you showed and it zoomed in on places. So if you have something that you can share, we'll pop it in there now, but if not, you and I can connect offline and then we'll try to figure out how to get that to people. But I just want to flag that for you.
Yeah, there is.
The other John, sorry, John Radke.
And I would just quickly say, go to Coca-Cola.com and type in sustainability, and you can kind of work your way down. And it's going to take several clicks, but you can get down to the water replenish program. And then you can access all of we call them fact sheets for all of our projects. Of course, you have to find the ones in the US. I do not have, that map that I showed is not on there. We are in the process of developing an interactive map that I'm hoping we can share outside with the public, but that'll come later this year. So.
Great, thank you.
And we do have an interactive map of our projects, and I will put a link in on that.
Oh, great, thanks, John.
And Judy, I just sent through a link, and hopefully it works. It looks kind of funny the way I posted it in, but it's a report by the WBCSD, the World Business Council Sustainable Development, that we supported, that basically catalogs a whole range of incentives for natural infrastructure. And a lot of that focuses around businesses using natural infrastructure for water quality regulation, water quantity regulation, and the business case for doing that per the question. So that might be a useful resource for people as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Carter. Rick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, kind of along those same lines, I'll get this one on the table, and maybe folks can do the same in terms of posting links if they're aware of any. Is there any literature discussing the economic value that landowners can derive from ecosystem service projects, carbon offsets, wetland banking, etc.?
Sorry, Rick, could you repeat the question? I couldn't quite hear that.
Sure. The question is there any literature discussing the economic value that landowners can derive from ecosystem service projects, carbon offsets, wetland banking, etc.? I know there are some things out there. The Texas Forest Service did a publication a year or two ago. A couple of the other states have done it in the South as well.
Yeah, I would say I'm just going to resend the link I just sent a moment ago. I think the link I'm sending addresses some of that. And I'd also direct people to the Natural Capital Coalition website. They have a whole suite of resources on this topic. And there's also the Economics for Ecosystems and Biodiversity, TEEB, which also has a catalog of resources on the economic benefits and case for ecosystem services and biodiversity. And I believe some of that is private landowners, but might be a bit more general. So it may or may not be useful for people.
I would love to get in a conversation, which we don't have time for now, about ecosystem services and natural capital and valuation of it and how much is it worth. And if you can apply a number to it, it could be worth millions of dollars, if you restore a forest or something, but somebody has to be willing to pay for that for it to turn into real dollars. And that's where there's a lot of, a lot of the stickiness comes from, about what is this worth. But we could go down a whole new, avenue, but we don't have time for it now.
Maybe that's a suggestion for a future chat, John. And since you made the suggestion, be careful what you say. Rick, do you mind if I jump in, because this has come up a couple of times, and I want to give Carter a chance to answer this. Carter, a question came up: can Carter give us an example of how the natural capital protocol and our natural capital accounts are actually used in the real world? Like, what does that actually look like?
Sorry, sure. We've worked on a few projects with clients to basically use the protocol to look at what their natural capital risks are across their supply chain. So in one case, for example, we were working with a big food and beverage company, and most of their goals were around water. And we used the protocol to look at where their risks were greatest. And what we found is that land use was actually a really big risk that wasn't being accounted for in the way in which they were thinking about their sustainability impacts and risks. One example that I think is a really good one, and that you can also find on the Natural Capital Coalition website, was an example from England, and that's Forest Enterprise England. And they are one of the first kind of organizations to create a sort of internal accounting system for their forest, and to really apply a lot of the steps in the natural capital protocol to more fully quantify what the value of those services are. And what they found is that the value of services delivered by England's woods and forests was about 11.9 billion pounds. And about over 95% of that value was a result of the benefits that aren't typically measured or valued, like the benefits to society through recreation and climate regulation. And so I think that's a really good example. Again, there's some other ones on the Natural Capital Protocol website. One other one that I think is really interesting and is more recent is it was a study that was done by Vivid Economics, I believe, in England, also to look at the benefits that natural parks with trees in them was providing to human health throughout England. And there's a partnership that was sort of informed as a result of this between the NIH and some of the parks throughout England, to basically where NIH was contributing some of their budget to protect parks because of the value that was determined that some of these forested parks were providing to human health. So I think that's another interesting example, and I can send you the reference for that, since I don't have that at my fingertips.
Carter, Leslie placed in the chat window a link to Forestry England.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect.
Great. Rick?
Yes, a question for John Radke. Can you elaborate on how your Replenish program measures water quantity versus watershed health? Are you more concerned with one or the other? Would most conservation easements contribute to your Replenish goals if in the right watershed?
Yeah, there's a few questions there. Initially, our Replenish program was, just really volumetric replenish, liters. And so we would look for projects where we can add up the number and hold it up against our sales volume. Our strategy is evolving to a point where now we really do look at watershed health, overall watershed health. As I don't know if I'd call it a metric, but as a goal. And what we found out is, we can't do it all ourselves to improve the health of a sizable watershed on our own, and that's where collaboration comes in. I know I've been harping on that a lot. What our new goal, our 2030 goal, is going to focus on is identifying a small handful of what we consider to be key highly stressed watersheds where we operate that are integral to our business, and then try to build a coalition, collaborative, to actually make a meaningful difference in that watershed. So I can't say we've done it yet, but we are trying to translate it into watershed health, and then all the metrics would come along with it. Actually create a scorecard is what we're looking at now for those watersheds, and looking at the different areas: water volume, water quality, habitat, that kind of thing. And what was the last part of the question?
Would most conservation easements contribute to replenish goals?
Yeah, I think that'd be a tool, in the toolbox, along with several other things too. But I think conservation easements would be a big part of that, at least in maintaining, what's there already.
While you're on a roll, John, a quick question here is: how are most of Coca-Cola's projects on privately owned property?
No, I would say no. Probably most of them are on. Oh, it's probably half and half. We have great relationships with the U.S. Forest Service, but then we also work with a lot of farmers and work in the ag communities. We work with cities, so it's really a mix. So no, it's probably half and half.
Okay. Carter, the question came in was, were those the only ecosystem accounts? Is there possibly one for weather, storm related soil erosion?
Yeah, great question. Those were just, what we've been doing over the past 3 years as a collaborative working group is to just develop a proof of concept for these pilot accounts. So we've started with the ones I listed, and the idea is that we keep building on that. So those are certainly things we could consider in the future, but at this point, the ones I showed up on the screen are where we focused on to date.
Okay. Another question for you is, does EY ever bring 2 or more corporations into cooperative relationships for achieving sustainability goals?
That's a great question. I mean, so what we do a lot of stakeholder engagement. So we help our clients, many of whom are private companies and businesses. We help them identify who their key stakeholders are and help them develop an engagement strategy to support their sustainability efforts. And so that could involve bringing together other businesses and companies who might be partners with them. It could also involve NGOs or government organizations. So we do that. And I don't really have a great example of when we've done that more recently, but we do that kind of work, especially in the context of stakeholder engagement.
Okay.
Can I add just quickly an example of that? And it's a really important point, and something that needs to be done. We need to do more of that. In California, we're part of this organization. It's a collaborative. It's called California Water Action Collaborative, and the acronym is QUAC. And it's about, let's see, we probably have 15 to 16, 17 companies, corporations, good sized ones, and probably 15 or 16 NGOs, and all come together. And it's a, really active, robust collaborative. We meet, every month. We have a face-to-face meeting, at least we used to, twice a year. And the whole purpose is to improve the water security for California. And so what we do is figure out projects that several companies might have an interest in investing in, and the NGO partners will bring those projects, and then you might have 4 or 5 companies that, yeah, it looks like a good one, let's do that one, and you're able to scale up the impact way more than just one single company investing. So it's a great example that I'm actually trying to replicate somewhere else in the country, in some large watersheds or stressed areas that we're interested in.
And part of the EY office in Atlanta actually helps to facilitate what they refer to as the Atlanta Sustainability Network.
Yes.
and they bring in, myself and kind of my peers from the other large Atlanta companies, as well as representatives from the city of Atlanta and the Georgia World Congress Center and some of those organizations as well, and talk about a host of different sustainability issues. And I know that Margaret Fisher, if she's still on, had asked the question in the chat about planning, creating habitats at corporate headquarters. And in that session, we had a couple of the companies come in. I know Cox was one, Congress Center was another, and Invesco was a third that had actually invested with Be Downtown and installed apiaries on their corporate campuses to help with the kind of the corridors for pollinators in that area. And so that's just one example of the types of things we talk about in those sessions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, John. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was sort of interpreting that question a little more narrowly about how we bring different clients together, but absolutely, we host a range of sort of networks like that, and we're participants, we help organize them. But I did think of one other example that I think is really important. And we have a client we're working with at the moment, and we are helping them coordinate across their supply chain to achieve their sustainability goals. And so we are bringing together all of the different actors, which are both industry organizations and companies, to think hard about how they can best work together to achieve shared sustainability goals, which is really important when you have a complex supply chain and you depend on people downstream and upstream to help you achieve your goals. So we have that's probably one of the best client examples I can think of. But yes, we do support a lot of coalitions and networks and things like that as well.
John Radke, conservation easements have come up in a couple of the questions, and they tend to be very similar, so I'll just ask one of them given the time. Conservation easements are difficult to maintain. Soil disturbance restrictions, which is sometimes necessary to control invasive species. Is Coca-Cola using forest conservation easements that allow ecological maintenance?
Boy, I don't know if I can answer that. I don't know if which type of easement that we have been supporting. So I would hate to throw out a wrong answer there.
Well,
part of what we do is whenever we get into a project like that we're going to invest in, we work with the partner to make sure that that land is going to be maintained in that, so it functions the way it's supposed to. In some cases, they even say they're going to do controlled burning and things like that if it's appropriate, like in the longleaf pines. But I can't answer the question as to what type of easement it is. Sorry.
let me jump in if you don't mind, Rick. We're down to our last 2 minutes. Instead of showing a couple of questions for polling at the end, just want to let everybody know that Leslie is going to be sending out a poll after this meeting, kind of a survey. We'd love to get your feedback on that. And we're going to try to answer some of these questions maybe offline. But the final question, again, in the last 2 minutes, and I just would like each one of you to answer. We won't be able to get to the entire question, but thinking on a landscape level, what barriers do you see to better recognition of and appreciation of ecosystem service values? John Mulcahy, do you want to start with that?
I'm not sure I totally understood.
Yep. Thinking on a landscape level, what barriers do you see to better recognition of and appreciation of ecosystem service values?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think that I don't know.
I have a thought about that. I think if I'm understanding the question, for me, one of the barriers is so many people live, in their urban community and city centers, and they don't get out to see, nature in its true state that often, and don't get to understand what the ecosystem services are providing them. They turn on their tap and they have water. they don't make that connection that, oh, this water actually comes from these, you know, headwater tributaries up in the forest, and we got to keep that forest there. Somehow, I think we got to find a way to make that connection better with people who aren't always out there in nature.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
I agree with that. And I would build on that and go back to, you know, something we discussed a few moments ago about, you know, working at the landscape scale and making information relevant to the people who use and depend upon that landscape. And a lot of times that involves translating the science of ecosystem services into metrics at the scale that's relevant to people who use and depend upon that landscape, and into the language that resonates with people. A lot of people don't speak the ecosystem service language or know ecosystem service science. So making it, translating it, I think, to people who have influence over the health of that landscape is really important. And that's a tough challenge. It's not easily done. So it does take work. And I think bringing these different stakeholders together is a really important way to do that.
Thank you so much for that. Well, we are just a minute over. I want to thank everybody for joining today, and John Mulcahy, Carter Ingram, and John Radke. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Let's connect offline and see if we can help answer some of these other questions. We had a lot of questions that we didn't get to, and we're sorry about that, but we'll try to figure out a way to get to them. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.